Hello and welcome to Season 2 of So Now What with Gates Cambridge, a podcast tackling some of the world's wicked problems with those dedicated to doing something about them. I'm Catherine Galloway, and my guests, as always, are Gates Cambridge scholars working to make an impact in the lives of others. And not just human lives either, but all life in all its teeming interdependence. A world with less life is less resilient and therefore immediately less stable. Or, to put it another way, destroying Earth's biodiversity is literally setting fire to our own lifeboat. Later this year, the UN Climate Summit, COP30, will bring delegates right into the Amazon, offering them a temporary home in Belém, Brazil, amongst the greatest concentration of biodiversity on Earth. It's a policy and rainforest first, but it's likely to take more than that to focus hearts and minds, as well as wallets and vested interests, on delivering a win-win for people and planet. So what does work when it comes to promoting conservation and biodiversity? My guests this month have an appropriately diverse range of solutions for us, and I'm delighted to be sharing the Zoom studio today with Christian Böhm, Gates Cambridge class of 2013, speaking to us from Berlin, Michael Paskovich, Gates Cambridge class of 2017, dialing in from Helsinki, and Anon Bayaskalan, who in 2019 was the first Gates Cambridge scholar from Mongolia and joins us today from Ulaanbaatar. Thank you all very much for aligning your schedules and time zones to be together today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thanks so much. Really nice to be here.
Now, Christian, you have swapped a synthetic plant biology lab in Cambridge for the corridors of government, and you're currently Deputy Head of Division, New Methods in Life Science, Biotechnology, Drug Development at the German Federal Ministry of Education and Research in Berlin. Research, funding and policy making on biodiversity and ecosystems is part of your brief there. And December 2022 found you in Canada, part of the European delegation negotiating the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, more commonly known as the Biodiversity Plan, at COP15. That committed us to protecting 30% of the planet for nature by 2030, halting and repairing the damage already done. Michael, you're a conservation ecologist taking on one of the world's most controversial crops, palm oil. It's in everything, everywhere, all at once, from our breakfast cereal to our detergents, in our pizza dough and ice cream, and glugging out of the can as biodiesels. Vast swathes of tropical rainforest are being destroyed for oil palm plantations. This much we know, but your research at the Natural Resources Institute in Finland takes you beyond those headlines and out into the field, working alongside independent farmers and large-scale industry everywhere from Indonesia to Liberia to find ways that we can make this product sustainable and possibly even positive for our ecosystems. And Anon, you have already persuaded luxury fashion houses and nomadic Mongolian goat herders to work together when our global demand for cashmere threatened to turn your native grasslands to dust. That campaign win at the Wildlife Conservation Society led you to redouble your efforts for market-based solutions to biodiversity threats, and you are now Chief Sustainability Officer for climate tech startup Eureka. Based in the world's coldest capital, where winter temperatures drop to minus 35 degrees, you're working with communities to make the switch from coal to solar power in an accessible and equitable way, making a significant impact on air pollution and habitat loss as a result. So everyone, we're sitting here right in the middle of a mass extinction event, losing species of all kinds at an unprecedented rate. And frankly, from where I'm sitting, that feels very overwhelming. We'll get on to how on earth you stay hopeful in just a moment, but let's start small by sharing the one thing that you're bringing to the table today that's going to help us begin. Anon, why don't you go first?
Hi, thank you for having me today here at the podcast. So today I bring to the table an appetite. So I would say it's a designer's appetite. So I think with regards to conservation, it's about creating a conglomeration of solutions that are usually not packed in together. So like someone who's very hungry, I want to look at the solutions in terms of what exists already, but how can we bundle it so that it provides what we want in terms of impact and conservation.
I love what you did there, and on taking our natural human greed and turning it into sort of and hungriness of our insatiable desire for resources and turning it into something positive. Thank you for bringing that. What about you, Christian? What are you bringing?
Well, thank you, Catherine. So, what I'm bringing to the table today is, in the first instance, a number 80%. And that is the portion of European ecosystems that are in poor condition, according to the Environment Council of the European Union. And this decline comes despite a decades-long continent-wide effort to preserve biodiversity. So, we clearly need to do better to protect our livelihoods.
That's extraordinary. 80% is in bad condition, and we're trying to reverse that with the 30 by 30 in the next 5 years. That's extraordinary. We'll get onto that in just a moment, but thank you for that number. It's very sobering. Michael, what are you bringing to the table today?
Yeah, thanks so much, Catherine. On first instance, I'm bringing a slightly raspier voice than normal because I'm a bit sick, so sorry about that.
Sorry about that too.
That's all right. And secondly, well, I'm bringing a spirit of optimism actually, and that's in part stemming from probably the reason why I am sick, which is that I was in Indonesia last week at a conference that's focused on sustainability in tropical agriculture and particularly oil palm. And I think agriculture and conservation often, many times, people don't see going hand in hand. And what I saw last week was a great variety of people from research, from NGO world, from growers and farmers and big industry, all in the same room trying to find some sort of common ground. And I think with a true attitude of wanting that as well, not just because they felt like it was good for optics or for some other purpose. So I think I'm sort of riding high on that last week.
That's lovely. And I think actually looking at all three of your profiles, that's something you all have in common. You are all very, very good at getting unlike people to talk to each other. And that seems to be the solution in this most interconnected of issues. It will take everyone. And building on that, Christian, we're trying to do this 30 by 30 within the next 5 years. That not only says that we'll protect those areas, but it's offering the almost unimaginable prospect of a green recovery. In other words, being able to claw back some of what we've already damaged and not just slowing down the devastation. And that is going to take everybody. And how are we going to get there?
Well, achieving the 30% conservation target requires integrated planning at both national and international levels. And I think governments must really commit to expanding and effectively managing protected areas on land and in the oceans to make it happen. And this is where it gets a bit complicated, to be honest, because areas that are protected may be unavailable or partially unavailable for other uses, such as agriculture, such as urban development, such as resource extraction, or even recreation. And there is no single correct answer to such land use conflicts, as priorities are set by a society through the political process. However, we can strive that these decisions are based on the best available information. Which areas are most fit for farming, which for housing, and which are most important for conservation. Now, we do already have a good understanding, a good general understanding of the main drivers of biodiversity loss, but there's still a lot to learn about how they spatially and temporally interact with one another within the ecosystem. And every day we're working very hard to identify the knowledge gaps that we have. Science can make a key contribution here. We need modern tools for effective observation of biodiversity. We also need to promote international standards of monitoring so that observations are globally comparable and allow elucidation of long-term trends. And finally, we also need to mainstream biodiversity into policies and practices across all sectors. So, for example, decisions in business, infrastructure, or in agriculture do not conflict with conservation.
Thank you, Christian. I'm going to bring in Michael here because you're exactly working in that knowledge gap, that information gap that Christian is talking about. Your research is trying to build the evidence that makes it a no-brainer to work differently, even on such a sort of vast and controversial crop such as palm oil, which, as you say, is not going anywhere. Therefore, we have to learn to work with it. So, what does that look like in practice, for example, in Indonesia or Liberia, where I know you work as well?
Yeah, thanks for that. And just to say, I think Christian's point on monitoring is one that's really relevant here. So, as Christian mentioned, we lack monitoring schemes in order to understand sort of baseline levels of biodiversity and how business as usual management practices and land use around the world affects biodiversity. And this is particularly true in tropical regions, for instance. And so here, we lack even very, very basic baseline data in many places. And this is because maybe they're hard to access or because there hasn't been as much research activity there historically for any number of reasons. And it could be because of a lack of capacity. There are several different reasons for why this might be. Um, and that's what some of our research has been focused on. So if we're talking then about in regards to oil palm, um, one of the pieces of work that I've been contributing to in Indonesia is now a 10 plus year project where we've been surveying biodiversity within the oil palm ecosystem and unpicking how it predicts crop yields and how changes in management also influences biodiversity, and whether we can find ways of managing plantations that is not harmful to biodiversity or potentially less harmful than business as usual and still allows us to have food security and supply. Um, and this is one of the few rare long-term biodiversity assessments actually happening in the tropics. And so it's a really rare and yes, valuable data set um, that is increasingly, I think, going to be used for investigating questions around climate change as well in tropical regions and in human modified habitats like agriculture. And then since you mentioned Liberia, um, there, a lot of the work that we've been doing is also what many people would consider quite basic conservation science, I would say. So we're investigating land use change, really. We're looking at what happens when you turn a rainforest into either an industrial oil palm farm or into a much sort of smaller scale farm that's run by local community members. And so it's a really needed starting point for us to then look at down the line how different interventions in land use and management um, are actually going to hopefully enhance biodiversity or at least to conserve it as well.
But when you're standing out there in the fields in Liberia, what are the local communities telling you that they are witnessing, and what are they telling you that they want? Because what's key here is working with the people who are on the ground and answering the need in a way that makes sense to them.
Yeah, absolutely. So what you just said is absolutely spot on with my personal ethos of conservation. I think it needs to be people-centered, and that's the way in which we really change sort of things in the real world towards a nature positive way. So when I'm working in Liberia, I mean, in just about the last 15 years, people in my study region, they've witnessed a huge amount of deforestation and that's come sort of as a result as well of some development that's happened as well. And so I think it's a really good example of one of these really tricky trade-offs in conservation in this region. The deforestation is it's not a good thing. I think we can all agree that tropical deforestation is never nice. Um, and people are aware of that. They know this. There are also economic and social benefits that have come as a result of agricultural development in this region. And I think effective conservation is going to require balancing those two things. So it's going to balance conserving the landscape while also ensuring that people within that region have access to the same rights and pathways to well-being and livelihoods that so many others around the world do. And so what do they want? I think people very much want their rainforest. They want their cultural legacy and they want their dignity. I think that's a very commonly shared human want. Um, and what they want, I think, are real and tractable solutions that can actually conserve rainforest and preserve and maintain livelihoods in the long term. So not anything short term, not anything that's just sort of uh, talk and no real action.
Anon, I'm going to bring you in here because this is exactly where you're working. Anon, you've written that the idea that you can separate economics and conservation is an illusion, and your business now is trying to prove the case for conservation and biodiversity through economic benefit. And in this case, I believe carbon offsetting and tech. Can you tell me how that works in Mongolia and how you're going to scale it?
Okay, so maybe I'll go back a little bit and provide you more of a context. So in my conservation work, we worked with a fashion conglomerate, as you mentioned before, a mining company. So they had a responsibility to do biodiversity offsets. And then we had the herder cooperatives themselves. And so oftentimes there are a lot of projects in Mongolia because about 80% of our land is actually pasture lands, where people are trying to, do these really, really well-intended conservation projects that have great funding, millions of dollars from donors. But as soon as the project is finished, you're left with some, of course, benefits, but then where's the sustainability aspect of it? And so at Eureka, we really see like one huge gap, which is a lot of these projects have trouble demonstrating impact. So they all use different standards, different methods in terms of proving that the impact, the intervention was able to save this many these kinds of species, or was able to really improve the quality of the pasture. So often what happens is the methodologies are really complicated, and people get kind of lost in the noise of it. And we're trying to make it simpler without, of course, losing the core elements of the impact that people want to see from conservation projects.
So the idea is to make it accessible and understandable and immediately applicable, and then it can scale.
Definitely. And so at Eureka, we work quite a bit on digital MRV systems. So it's digital monitoring, reporting, and verification systems. And this is extremely important for large donors who are providing millions of dollars in finance to projects, right? Especially climate projects. And you can't roll out this much money without doing the monitoring beforehand and afterwards. And it really needs to be scaled. So sure, you can take clippings from different pasture areas, but can you do that for thousands and thousands of hectares of land, right? So we're trying to provide a technology that makes it that uses really, cutting edge, for example, AI technology, combined with also remote sensing, combined with existing, phone-based apps to make this kind of MRV more accessible and useful for not just the producers, but also the funders.
So it would seem to me, Anon, that what you and Michael are doing, which is getting out there and gathering that information that Christian needs to then get back to the negotiating table and say, look, this works. I mean, that is the interconnectedness there of research and policy, isn't it? Anon, you described recently going to COP29 in Baku in Azerbaijan just at the end of last year. And you said that your approach there was one of stubborn optimism. And I'd like to come back to this question because you're working in a very scary space, all three of you, and despair at the speed and the scale of the loss that we're talking about, the potential destruction for all of us is very real. So what are your methods for keeping your eye on the prize? How do you keep impactful when actually the situation is almost too much to handle?
So the term stubborn optimism, I borrowed it from Christiana Figueres, who's one of my climate heroes. I think one definite thing I do to keep my optimism alive is to turn my phone off, to stop reading all these news headlines, especially political ones these days. So really, to put yourself under a rock if you need to maintain your mental health. But another way to really keep your optimism alive is also to leave your general setting. So I live in Ulaanbaatar, which is a really busy city. So just getting out of the city and realizing that you're also in a bubble, and that outside of your city there can be there is land that is silent, and you can hear nature. It's not like everything, we've destroyed the entire world, right? So there's so much to be thankful for. There's still really pristine areas out there in the world that we should appreciate. Yeah.
Christian, you're in the heart of politics. You can't turn off your phone. You can't turn off your headlines. So how do you cope? How do you keep that optimism going?
Well, what Onan just said actually quite well resonates with me, because even though I'm involved in policy processes, doesn't mean I need to spend the half day doom scrolling. And in addition to that, I believe it's really important to celebrate the small and big wins that do happen also in the area of biodiversity and conservation. One memory that really sticks out for me and keeps me going is actually the adoption of the GBF that you mentioned already, Catherine.
The biodiversity plan.
The biodiversity plan, that is, exactly, with the 30 by 30 being one of the targets within the plan. So I remember this moment. It was 3:30 in the morning. I was there as a negotiator on behalf of the German Research Ministry, and had been spending the night in this plenary room of the Palais des Congrès in Montreal. And when the adoption finally happened, it marked the culmination of more than 2 years of intense negotiation. So people got off their seats, they were clapping and cheering and hugging, and the relief was palpable right then. And it was a beautiful moment that I still like going back to when I need a bit of extra motivation.
That's absolutely lovely. Thank you. It's made me a bit teary. Michael, what about you? You came into this conversation feeling optimistic. How do you maintain that once you get back from Indonesia and that jet lag fades a little bit and you start getting back to work? How do you keep going?
Yeah, well, I'm definitely optimistic, but not stupid, I think is the way to view it. So, yes, we have to bring a sense of optimism to the table, but while recognizing that the challenge is absolutely immense. And I mean, the way that I best maintain the sense of optimism is doing similar things to what we're doing just now. So it's maintaining conversations with people around it. And I'm really fortunate to work with really nice colleagues here in Finland. I worked with great people when I was based in the UK, and I have many friends who are also in similar sectors to me. One of my best friends also works on conservation in Liberia. So it's this amazing kind of network of really engaged and proactive people who are also trying to make progress towards a similar um, goal in conservation, I guess, as what I am, and it really does help to keep spirits high. But that's not to say though that I don't have low moments. I do, and I think it's important for us to talk about those as well, and not just bury them and pretend like everything's rosy.
Well, you've got each other on speed dial now, thanks to this podcast. So please use that amazing Gates Cambridge resource too when you need a bit of an offload. Anon, do you have a standout moment like Christian was talking about around the table at COP15 where you thought, gosh, this is why I do it?
I do, actually. I mean, I think I have a handful of stories, but there's definitely some very precious moments I had with herders when I was working on the Sustainable Kashmir project in the Gobi Desert of Mongolia. We were spending the night actually with a herder family in their yurt, and it was the breeding season, so it was around March. And what was really, touching to me was the fact that during the breeding season, for about an entire month, the herder family didn't get much sleep. So it was like it was like a human who had a newborn. So the entire night they would go around, go into their pen and start looking for new, baby goats and sheep that were being born, in case they froze to death, because it was, as you mentioned, for -30 degrees or somewhere along that line. And they would literally put that much attention to every single baby animal. And there would be like a couple of animals in their yurt where they'd be like bottle feeding them because their mother died during birth. And it was just such a touching moment. And I think it also captures the essence of even conservation for me, because it's this kind of relationship that a human has with land, with an animal, even if it's a domestic animal that's not completely, what do you call it, completely taken over by capitalistic values, right? That's what I want to maintain. Like, this is what I want to keep in the world, because I see that becoming more and more rare and scarce in the world today.
It's that sense of conservation is literally care, and care for things beyond ourselves, right? Isn't it? Yeah. It's that deep, deep sense of caring. Michael, did you have a moment like that kind of lit up a light bulb for you?
Absolutely. And mine, it was the first time I was in rainforest, I was 19 probably, 18, 19, and I was in Belize. And for me, I had watched nature documentaries growing up, and I grew up in a quite connected to nature household, but nothing could have prepared me though for a tropical rainforest. Just the amount of sounds and sights, and really what stands out to me is the smell of a forest. There's just honestly nothing like it. And it's one of the reasons why today I continue to advocate for people to be able to have that experience, even though, of course, we should be traveling less and everything else. But it really does leave an imprint. And the number of people I've spoken to who have had that same experience is amazing. And now I've had the huge privilege of having that experience in the American tropics, in the Southeast Asian tropics, and now in the West African tropics. And it never, ever gets old. It is truly a remarkable experience.
So clearly those COP30 organisers knew what they were doing by bringing the delegates right into the Amazon for this next summit. Let's hope that has the effect that you've described on all of those negotiations. Christian, when you're preparing for these big wins, such as you see with all the fanfare at a COP like that, the biodiversity plan, actually the vast majority of the work, it's like an iceberg, isn't it? You've done beforehand and you don't see it. What does that actually look like?
So it's a very long process, obviously, and we're trying to get our hands on as much information as possible. We're consulting with stakeholders in the area. We're inviting different scientific experts to the ministry. And based on that, we're basically developing an initial position. And then that position is hierarchically expanded with, at the first level, the different ministries in the country. And then as soon as you have an agreed German position, it goes to the European Union. Then you agree a position on this level. And that's what you're bringing on the table at the COPs.
But it feels like 2 steps forward, 1 step back all the time, or some there are going to be blockages at every point along the way. Is it down to human relationships at the end of the day?
Yes, so human relationships are absolutely essential in these kind of processes. What usually happens is that the different parties present start with their initial negotiation positions that they agreed nationally. And then you get talking, and then you try to identify common landing grounds. What is quite interesting to me is that in practice, oftentimes this kind of approaching the landing area just tends to happen in the few final days of these COPs. Oftentimes it's the last 24 or last 12 hours that are most essential.
That focus of like, we cannot go home with nothing.
Certainly that feeling of pressure helps a lot getting to an agreement and to an understanding, which is why the GBF was agreed on at 3:30 in the morning.
Michael, you talked about tricky trade-offs in this debate, right, a little bit earlier in the podcast. And I guess a key question for all of you as well as we're wrapping up here is, when we're up against it in terms of time and in terms of resources and in terms of information, How do you choose what to conserve if we have to make trade-offs and you need to make hard choices? Do you go for the biodiversity hotspots? There are 36 of those, I believe, around the world. You put everything into getting those secure and safe, or do you do something different?
So I would say I don't think we should approach it as a we need to choose only one option. So for instance, investing only in the biodiversity hotspots. I don't think that that's really realistic for many people, but also I think it could cut a lot of people out of the conversation, although they should certainly be a priority. So that I think is absolutely spot on. I think there's probably no one right answer, to be honest. I think it will probably depend on region. It will probably depend and vary across different cultural groups, and it'll probably vary across ecosystems as well, and with respect to like economic resources also. So I think when we talk about conservation, a lot of times we talk about priorities, and there's often an assumption that the priorities are the same across different areas, and that's not always the case. And I think in order to maximize global benefits to conservation, maybe we do need to make some harder decisions. It certainly requires conversations, like I'm sure Christian has a lot across borders. But on the other hand, it does also require um, meeting people and respecting them with where their priorities are as well. That will be my start to that.
Christian, what about you when you have to make those trade-offs? You get the highs of the moment when everyone hugs around the table, but how do you get there?
Absolutely. I think it's a fascinating question that you're posing, Catherine, and also like very much Michael's approach to answering it. So, as a funder, we're also quite frequently facing this challenge of deciding where to put our money, obviously. Um, and the public frequently expects us to conserve, especially those very charismatic big mammals, the tigers and the panda bears, for example. Um, but when you look at it a bit more closely, then you find that it's often the soil, microorganisms, mites, worms, and so on that are essential to the overall functioning of the ecosystem. This is also a challenge that we need to address as a research funder, finding a compromise between those two.
Thank you. I mean, Anon, you're making the case literally for that soil that Christian was talking about, that huge ecosystem. So how do you go about it? How do you say this is vital and this is why?
In the case of Mongolia, at least, it's really important to look at linear infrastructure because we are actually a very open and vast country. What becomes our biggest threats are usually the creation of roads, fences, so fences along railroads. What else? Highways. And I think I would prioritize actually maintaining corridors across biodiversity hotspots within our country, for example, because at least in our case, we are a nomadic country, and mobility, being able to move hundreds of kilometers when there's no, precipitation one summer, is our survival tactic. So I think maintaining this permeability across landscapes is the biggest priority for us.
Thank you. I mean, Anon, you've sent me right back there because I've had the privilege of traveling across Mongolia before, and those huge, huge landscapes are just seared in my mind. We've come almost to the end of our podcast, very sadly, and we have to ask, so now what? Because in this topic, more than any other that we've covered so far, that sense of interconnectedness is so clear. If we do this, then that happens, either positively or negatively. So can you give us some tools to make an immediate difference from where we are, from who we are, to start that ripple effect happening?
So I would like to put a focus on supply chains. So this is something I haven't mentioned before, but it's supply chains that are really like depicting the entire story in terms of the impact of all this extraction that's happening on Earth. So, for example, in my case, it was definitely the Kashmir supply chain that was really meaningful, and that was where we were able to create the impetus for conservation. But in any other area, if you just go down to the products that you use most, if you look at that and look at what kind of impact that has on the land, that'll really give you, one area for conservation that maybe you may have an impact on. So maybe it's cotton, or maybe it's even coffee, but pick that product and look at its entire supply chain down to where it's produced, and you will see a conservation story. And I think you need to be a conscientious consumer, and I think you should be a bit curious and see what you can do as a consumer to make sure that you are on the right side of history in terms of conservation.
So conscious consumerism rather than conspicuous and endless consumption, that is the key, isn't it? Buying much more ethically and aware than we have got used to over the past years. Michael, what about you? What's your so now what?
So my so now what is I'm gonna quickly make the case for more evidence. So I think that since the need is so pressing in conservation, that there can be a lot of temptation to have knee-jerk reactions on ways in order to solve different aspects of the conservation crisis. And it's great to have that energy and that momentum, but we have limited resources. And so I think we need to prioritize those resources where we have evidence that strategies are working. And when we don't have the answer to that, I think that we need to be very upfront about then where we need more resources to be able to understand what viable solutions exist and then to actually demonstrate that those solutions are effective. So that will be kind of my thing that I'll leave us with today is the importance of evidence and continuing to invest in evidence.
And also the role to inform ourselves, right? The need to be knowledge rich before we can do anything meaningful. Christian, what about you? What's your so now what?
I would like to use my minute to focus my answer to this question a bit more on what we all can do. And to that end, allow me to share a little success story. In 1995, 14 gray wolves were reintroduced into Yellowstone National Park, marking the start of a groundbreaking restoration effort. And as the wolves began to hunt, elk altered their grazing patterns, allowing native vegetation such as willows to recover. Next returned were the beavers, the dams, and we had a changed river architecture. And ultimately, the reintroduction of wolves spurred a so-called trophic cascade that benefits numerous other species and has helped reestablish a balanced ecosystem. Now, I'm not suggesting that we all introduce grey wolves into our backyards, but leaving just a bit of room for wilderness in our gardens, providing a living space for native plants, insects, birds, and possibly small mammals will go a long way. You will be surprised.
Thank you very much, Christian, because actually, gosh, 14 wolves only creates that enormous cascade of change that you were talking about. And that actually feels achievable, not in our backyards, but as a number, that feels possible to effect really quite large scale change. So thank you for starting us with a number and bringing us back home with a number. And that's it for this episode. So huge thanks to my guests today: Christian Böhm, Deputy Head of Division in the German Federal Ministry of Education and Research and Vice President of the International Human Frontier Science Programme, the HFSP; conservation ecologist Michael Paszkiewicz, currently a research scientist at the Natural Resources Institute in Finland; and Anon Bayagasalan, Chief Sustainability Officer at the climate tech startup Eureka, based in Mongolia. To all three of you, may your ideas and your impact continue to grow, and thank you for empowering the rest of us to do something, anything, to help you. My thanks too to producers Mandy Garner from Gates Cambridge and Nick Saffel from the Central Communications Office at the University of Cambridge. And of course, thanks to all of you for listening. A brand new episode drops every month, so do let us know what you think. I'm Catherine Galloway, and this was So Now What with Gates Cambridge. Join us again next time for another wicked problem dissected by those determined to do something about it.